We often think that the scariest prisons or cages are the ones with bars and locks and things of that nature. But in fact, the most effective prisons, the most effective cages are the ones that have no lock, where we simply opt into it, where we decide that we're going to abide by those individual rules. For me, Problems and Profits is just about a choice, a decision. It's literally, in this moment, are you going to decide to make the most of it, or are you going to decide to just let it go past you? And for me, I've never regretted leaning into an opportunity. I've never regretted taking on a challenge or a problem and trying to solve it. And any of those failures, and there's a lot, there's just a wreckage of failures behind me. But any one of those individual failures is actually, when you take the broad perspective, it's just an iteration of an eventual success. It's actually invigorating to have a problem to solve. And again, I think far too often we choose to view it as a negative challenge rather than an opportunity.
Problems are what? Problems are profits!
Welcome to season 2 of the Problems or Profits podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Lynn Matheson, aka the Canadian Cottage Girl, and I'm joined by my co-host, the Matt McKeever. And today we actually got a special episode for you guys where Matt is going to break down a bit of his backstory. And Problems or Profits, it truly embodies the principle of just overcoming whatever obstacle is in your way. So running through walls, being agile and sidestepping those obstacles, or just being able to adapt and expand your mindset to overcome them. So I'm really excited to actually hear a little bit more about what's gotten you to this point and some of your own Problems or Profits stories here, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think before even jumping into any of my personal Problems and Profits story, maybe just refreshing everyone on how Problems and Profits even really came to be. And so back in 2016, 2017, the start of 2016, I quit my day job as a CPA to essentially be financially independent, retire early, whatever you want to call it, or go build my empire in real estate holdings. And when I originally got started, networking was a really big aspect there. So myself and Jeff Weibel, we threw ourselves into every networking opportunity we could, just wanting to meet as many people as possible, learn from as many people as possible, and really just expose ourselves to all these other real estate investors out there and try and learn, all their secrets, tips, and tricks and things of that nature. And as we continued to network, we continued to learn more. As we continued to play around on social media, people began to care more and more about our opinions or our perspectives as well. And, finally, there was a moment in time where it stopped being myself and Jeff necessarily talking to people and learning from them, and more people really coming to us with their issues or their problems. And having built up the reference bank of just other people's experiences, other people's stories, we started to realize that just about every one of those problems actually had a huge opportunity behind it. So whether it's someone complaining about how terrible all tenants are, well, first of all, probably not all tenants are terrible, but even if they are, there's probably a solution there where you could perform a service for other landlords and be able to really satisfy their needs when they don't want to interact with their tenants. Or whether it's the contractor that rips you off, right? And wow, there's a huge opportunity there for someone to start a contracting business that doesn't rip people off. And it was one of those situations where it can be really easy to, see the speck in your neighbor's eye versus the log in your own eye. And we started to realize, wow, I actually really appreciate all these people coming with their problems to us because these ones are so easy to solve. And that naturally makes you start to look inward and think, well, what sort of problems am I overlooking, or what sort of problems am I avoiding? And I think no matter where you turn, there's always an opportunity to take that problem, that obstacle, that thing in your way, and actually pivot and use it to your advantage. And, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands of examples I could draw upon. But one of the ones that stands out for me is right when I originally decided to quit my day job. So it was February 2016. And I was starting to think, this pharmaceutical industry stuff, I don't really like it. I don't necessarily love the way we do business. A lot of people are perhaps cutthroat or very career focused and oriented. And it just feels very distant. And so I naturally knew that I wanted to get out of that environment because I understand the fact that we are the sum of our inputs. And I was really scared to take that leap. And one of the things that really gave me comfort or gave me the confidence to be able to move forward was really just sitting down and mapping out the worst case scenarios. What were all the problems? And could I actually overcome these individual problems? And so being a CPA, an accountant, financially oriented, seeing how financial independence is what was going to buy me this freedom, one of the big concerns was just money. What would happen if I ran out of money? What would happen if all my tenants stopped paying me? What if? And as I sat down and wrote out each one of those what ifs, it turned out there was almost always a solution. So it was, one of my big concerns was, what if just everyone stopped paying me? I was like, I don't know. I guess I would lose all my properties. And I was like, well, would you literally lose every single one? And I was like, I could probably, even if all my tenants stopped paying me, the property I live in, I could probably find a way to make it work because I would just knock on their door every day until they paid me or get new tenants. And surely I could manage one property regardless of how bad the world or my existence became. And so I was like, okay, well, that works. What if that's maybe just not enough, the rent you're collecting there to hold on to the property? And then I thought, well, worst case scenario, I guess I could camp in my backyard and Airbnb my apartment in the summer, or I could take on a roommate, or I could take on another roommate. And, what about winter? I guess I could just buy a shitty RV and live in the laneway and rent out my apartment year round if things really got in a sticky situation. And it turned out all these problems or all these fears I had, the moment you started to shine light on it, it became very obvious that it was in my control. I could always pivot. I can remember writing down worst case scenario, I could work under the table for my one contractor friend. I'm sure I'm not good, but he'll probably pay me at least $15 an hour. And literally, again, to get comfortable with some of these ideas, I tested them out. So I can remember for 2 or 3 days, I worked with my buddy who was a drywaller, and essentially I was mainly just a prop for him, but just helped him hold up drywall while we were doing ceilings and run and grab shit from the truck or go to the store to pick up materials. And again, I was like, okay, well, if this is the worst case scenario, it's probably not actually all that bad. And so I guess just to bring it full circle, for me, Problems and Profits is just about a choice, a decision. It's literally, in this moment, are you going to decide to make the most of it, or are you going to decide to just let it go past you? And for me, I've never regretted leaning into an opportunity. I've never regretted taking on a challenge or a problem and trying to solve it. And any of those failures, and there's a lot, there's just a wreckage of failures behind me. But any one of those individual failures is actually, when you take the broad perspective, it's just an iteration of an eventual success. And I think far too often people want that immediate success. They want the immediate profit. And what they don't understand is, one, even if you got it, you wouldn't be able to hold on to it, because having got it too easy, you won't respect it. And having got it very easy, you won't even understand how to keep it. And so for a lot of us, it is truly that journey of learning to take these problems, these obstacles, pivot them into profits or at least opportunities that's going to allow you to become the resilient person that can go about and deal with anything. And so that to me is why this podcast needs to exist. It's why we need to tell these stories, is because every single person's got their own journey. They've got their own experiences, but it's really important to understand we all get to choose to make the most of those individual experiences.
Yeah, I can definitely appreciate where you're coming from there, Matt. And it is cool to hear just your perspective. And, if this thing fails, then I can still do this. And if this thing fails, I'll still be okay. I can sleep in an RV. I can tent it. Because a lot of people, they get hung up on those things. But what I love about your story is that you didn't, although you were still working through them all. You thought of every potential option that it could go, but you didn't let that hold you back. And I think that that's the difference in that decision of making a choice to actually take the step forward, even though there could be things that go wrong and it might be a little uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. And one last thing, I just wanted to build upon that, because was certainly the case for myself, and I suspect for a lot of other people. we often think that the scariest prisons or cages are the ones with bars and locks and things of that nature. But in fact, the most effective prisons, the most effective cages are the ones that have no lock, where we simply opt into it, where we decide that we're going to abide by those individual rules. And I think that it takes a unique perspective to be able to actually just start getting the fact that any problem can be solved, that any problem can be turned into a profit. And for a lot of us, it's first just understanding that, like, hey, even if I find myself in this unfortunate situation, even if I find myself in this cage, it's probably not actually locked. And in fact, it's just a matter of me getting out of my mental prison. It's a matter of me exiting Plato's cave, whatever analogy you want to use. It's really just about taking individual ownership.
Absolutely. And as you've evolved, have you found that your problems have evolved as well? Like, what are the more recent things that you're really trying to expand on or really solve?
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting about problem solving and taking on challenges and taking on new challenges. And, the challenges or problems I'm faced with today, depending on your interpretation, probably would have scared the shit out of me six years ago or 5 years ago back in 2016. Whereas I've just became acclimated to it. Once you start leaning into it, once you start taking ownership, I think that there's this addictive feedback loop where you actually start really wanting to take on bigger challenges and push your side outside of your comfort zone, like you discussed in the previous episode. And so for me these days, I guess the windmills or the dragons that I'm tilting at are different than the ones I originally did. And they're a little bit more abstract these days, but it's actually invigorating to have a problem to solve. And again, I think far too often we choose to view it as a negative challenge rather than an opportunity. So right now, the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is culture and society and the future, and maybe just, is there an opportunity to nudge it in a better direction? Or is there an opportunity to take a swing at reinventing it on my own? And honestly, again, those were, until very recently, those were very much prisons of my own making, where there was no lock, there was no door. It was just a matter of stepping up and stepping out. But it can be really easy if you find yourself in a headspace, a society, a circle of friends, or a circle of influence where individuals maybe aren't taking on that problems and profits mentality. And so again, I hope that this podcast helps serve a lot of individuals that maybe they know what's the right thing to do. They know what's the challenge that they should be conquering, and yet they're just waiting for someone to give them permission. And oftentimes no one's going to do it. So it's just a matter of looking inward and giving yourself permission.
Absolutely. Now, Matt, I'd love to hear a little bit more of the backstory, or what really has allowed you to have that problems or profits mentality.
Yeah, I think that it's just I suppose a lifetime of experiences of just understanding that whenever something doesn't go your way, the more you pick at it, the more you dig deep into it, you start to realize, like, oh, there's a way that this circles back to me. Oh, there's a way where I can interpret this, that this is my failing or my fault, rather than necessarily looking for someone else to point it to. And, I'm sure there's a variety of things I could attribute it to, but one of the things that stands out that I think I'm very fortunate for is just growing up on a farm. And there's a certain, DIY mentality about growing up on a farm, because if the nearest hardware store is half an hour away and you're just trying to get this thing done, it just needs to last until the end of the day, oftentimes you're going to become much more resourceful. And so I think that I've continued to focus on trying to become more resourceful with time and just expose myself to new challenges and new opportunities, and, take on any that are inviting or interesting. And so I think that that's a big aspect there, is simply having the opportunity and the constraints to be able to force oneself into becoming more resourceful or more creative when it comes to problem solving.
Absolutely. Yeah. I really like something that you said there about really taking ownership ultimately over your decision making. And one of the things that you really touched on there is that DIY mentality, that Renaissance spirit of being able to overcome all of the obstacles and really problem solve all of those things in your day and in your life. So I really love that you've highlighted that, Matt.
Awesome. Yeah, appreciate it.
Great. Is there anything else that you'd really like to share on today's episode that can give some context to your backstory here, Matt?
I think that we covered it well. What I'd really just love to leave the listener with is understanding that, again, regardless of which guest you maybe connect with the most on our podcast, that at the end of the day, each one of them had a similar mentality. Whether it's the mentality that they attack all of life with, or it's the mentality they simply attacked one narrow niche of life with, is just leaning into the opportunities, taking ownership of it, and choosing to make the most of those problems and turning them into profits.
Matt, before we finish up this podcast, I would love to ask you a few common questions that you ask here on the podcast. So, Matt, what is the most expensive thing that you've ever broken?
Yeah, and I know that it's common for people to say their mindset on here, and I often think that that's a little bit of a cheat, but it obviously one can find oneself in bad mental spaces, and there's definitely a huge cost to that. But for me, taking the question more literally, there's not a lot that was really expensive I've broken. I attribute one of the things to just not having expensive shit, but probably one of the things that was mildly expensive that also was stressful was scratching my dad's pickup truck. And so this was actually, I was working on a rental property. I think I was even retired at this point in time, and I borrowed my dad's truck, and I was, it's the stupidest thing ever, going through a drive-through and been working too much and not paying enough attention, and just kind of rubbed something, and one of those yellow barriers. And so essentially it just enough just to leave like a hairline little scratch along and a little bit of yellow paint rub. And there's no great lesson in it. It was just a silly, stupid moment where I wasn't present and paying attention. And I try and remember that because it doesn't matter whatsoever. And yet it was definitely something that caused a lot of stress that shouldn't have.
Absolutely. I hear you. It's almost the stress too of what's going to happen when you tell the person about their car. Okay. Next question here for you, Matt, is if you had $1 million in only 24 hours, what would you do with it?
Yeah. For me, I kind of lean towards doing something very silly with it. And so what comes to mind is, I think too many people take too much too seriously. And so one of the things that, if you guys haven't been following me on social media, I've been dabbling with NFTs a bit. So I think it would be fun to literally buy $1 million NFT and then sell it to the null address, or send it to the null address, which would be essentially burning the money, literally just lighting it on fire. I think that there's an aspect of performance art there that if the money was never mine and I never earned it in the first place, I'm not particularly attached to it. So I think that the inner comedian in me would get a lot of great joy from that.
I think a lot of people would get a lot of great joy from that too.
There would also be a lot of hate.
Yes. Okay, Matt. Final question for you here is, why are you you?
And I thought about this a lot as we've asked each guest, because it is one of my favorite questions to ask. And there's a variety of things one can attribute to how you become oneself. I definitely like to think that it's a curiosity and a desire to learn, but even more so, I think that there's always been a desire in me for community and for belonging. And in fact, even more so than just an arbitrary belonging, but actually being connected. And I think that somewhere along the way, society lost a lot of the connections that we have today. I think that there's been a lot of things given up or sacrificed that shouldn't have been. And so for me, I think the reason, for anyone that's been following me over these last few years, the reason I do any of the shit I do is in the hopes or the desire of creating a community that I would want to belong to. And so that definitely has led me to things like the social lab, the living with my wholesalers, the the next chapter of my life as well. And all the different meetup groups that we've made, all the different podcasts, all the different networking events we've attended was both a sampling as well as a desire to find that community. So I think that that's a big aspect, a reoccurring theme in my life.
Awesome. Well, Matt, thanks for sharing all of that. And really looking forward to season 2 here on the Problems or Profits podcast. So cannot wait for all of you guys to hear from all of the fantastic guests that we have coming on in this season, and really leaning into that problems or profits mindset in your own lives. So we'd love to hear some stories from you. So make sure you engage, follow us on Facebook, really make sure you subscribe to all of the different platforms. Spotify, we're on Apple as well. And we always look forward to hearing your problems or profit stories as well. So thanks so much for joining us on another episode of the Problems or Profits podcast. We'll see you on the next one.